Take it away, Chuck.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Hope so.
We're good. Yep.
Okay. So agenda today, it's first of all, club status, quick information, anything here for future meetings coming up. Tom usually do that. Because I don't have my notes in front of me for the future meetings.
They're listed on the next slides there, Chuck.
On the next slide, okay. And then officers, new members, suggestions for topics, any club questions, and then today's topic is communications off-grid. Oh yeah, here's the future meetings. Thursday, June 18th, and that probably won't be in the Caribbean. Be probably web-only meeting. Better Smartphone Photography by Jim Beardsley, Tips, Tricks, and Tools. And then the Max Sig Friday, that'd be tomorrow, and he did send an agenda on that, but that's a web-only meeting. Our officers are Jim Homan, President, Linda Brown, Vice President, Paul Ebert, Membership Secretary, Mike Griffin, Treasurer, and Max Sig. And then I, Chuck Scott, I'm Secretary, and then Andrew Petruski, Communications Coordinator, and then Tom Kreutzer is Director at Large. One thing we do need help with still is someone that can help us with organizing food events, for example, the sandwich meetings when we have those, July picnic, and November pizza meeting. And basically duties are order and or pick up food and supplies and coordinate that and get that done. And then the club reimburses all expenses related to that. To coordinate the helpers, and usually there's a good number of people willing to help to get the task done, to get the food. Our members, old and new, make sure that if you haven't paid your dues this year, make sure you get your $8 dues to Paul Ebert. And if you do happen to get a change of email, for example, if you retire, make sure you get that to any one of the members so that we get that address changed, so we can keep you in contact with what we're doing. If you have any suggestions for topics, email your ideas for topics. Be sure to also, if you wish, talk to any one of the board members. And if you'd like to present, and I presented already before, and I'm presenting today, and it's not that hard to do, and sometimes it's kind of fun, so definitely suggest it if you have something you'd like to talk about. On our website, we have our past meeting slides and handouts, recordings of our past meetings, a section which has deals, our eBites newsletter, and if you have any tips and hints, any questions, anything, favorite links, for sale information or articles, make sure you get that to Tom Kreutzer. And the site here, you see it, sites.google.com site. And I can't even say that's not unpronounceable, PC Club. And click on that link. Okay, any club questions? Okay, with that.
And I will say that during the presentation itself, if you have a question, please put it in the meeting chat, and then either I or Tom will relate that question then.
Yeah, good, thanks, because I probably won't see those. So the presentation today, communications off the grid. And so hopefully one of the questions that goes across your mind is, why in the world would anybody care about communications other than with a mobile phone? Mobile phones are ubiquitous and everybody's got them, and you almost seemingly can use it most everywhere. I want to talk a little bit about that, and also include some true stories, including one from a personal perspective and how it's useful for me and has been in the past. Talk a little bit about how off-grid communication works and how what your choices are for off-the-grid devices, some pros and cons about some of the devices, some of the extra built-in features that come with some of those devices, some costs, and both for the product and also for subscriptions. So just like your mobile phone These devices generally, not always, but generally have subscriptions related to them in order to use them. Talk a little bit about where you can buy them if you're interested. And if you just want to try it out or use it for short term, there are some places where you can rent them. And then I'll also include some recommendations for you. So cell phone limitations. A mobile phone is just a radio. As well, it's also a computer. And without a cell phone tower, you are not going to communicate with anybody when it comes to a mobile phone. And there are places in North America where a cell phone won't work. And probably most everybody has run into this. And here's a coverage map that shows areas that are in purple where coverage exists, and those white areas are where coverage does not exist. And you'll see, for example, out west, there's some big white areas in the mountains and areas that where you frankly just can't get communications. Incidentally, I read it. If you notice down also in West Virginia, there's a white area there. There's actually a national radio quiet zone. It's a 13,000 square mile area that limits radio frequency in the eastern half of West Virginia and parts of Virginia and stretching out to Maryland border, where they don't allow cell phones because it would interfere with National Radio Astronomy telescope there. Cell phone limitations extend up into northern Minnesota, where I spend a fair amount of time. I like canoe trips, and anytime you want to get up into like the Gunflint Trail, you're going to find very quickly that you don't have cell phone coverage. Cell phone limitations. 4G range is limited to between 1 and 10 miles, depending on different factors. I'll get that in a second. Your 5G range is about 300 meters, which works out to be a little less than 0.2 of a mile. Cell phone range factors, and I got this from Wikipedia. The working range of a cell phone site where you get reliable connections is not a fixed figure. It will depend on a number of factors, including, but not limited to, the height of the antenna over a surrounding terrain, which is known as line of sight propagation, the frequency of the signal in use, the transmitter's power, the required uplink, downlink data rate of the subscriber's device, directional characteristics of the antenna array. In other words, they can actually position antennas such that they get better coverage in one direction or another. Reflection or absorption of radio energy by buildings or vegetation definitely makes a difference. Even things like trees and bushes can make a difference in how well your signal is received, and also can be limited by local, geographic, or regulatory factors and weather conditions. Things like thunderstorms can affect it. In addition, there are timing limitations with some technologies where they will take a frequency and they will use timing to share the same frequency between multiple users. So if you've ever traveled to places, remote areas, things like national parks, forests, Alaska, outside of the United States, you're going to run into places where there isn't any cell phone coverage. And I ran into this on a trip when I was up in Alaska, where we took a boat ride out of Whittier, and with inside the dock, all of a sudden we didn't even have cell phone coverage anymore. So probably most everybody's run into that at one point or another. Activities where you're very likely to run into a lack of cell phone coverage, things like wilderness canoe trips, flying fishing up into Canada, hunting, hiking if you're off into national forests or national parks and you like to hike back on the trails, snowmobiling and skiing. You can run into areas where you don't get coverage. The rationale for off-grid communications basically extend your communication coverage to beyond what you can get with a mobile phone, to communicate bidirectionally with anybody who has the ability to communicate with email or SMS text. Basically for safety reasons, number one, to get help in the event of emergency, to let people know that you need help, and more than just needing help, the nature of your emergency, because if your emergency happens to be that your vehicle broke down, that might be maybe less urgent than all of a sudden you've been injured severely and need immediate medical attention. With the case of some devices, you can get weather forecasts and allow you to avoid high winds or thunderstorms or blizzards. You can, and I find this last point very important, to allay fears, to let your family know that you're okay, communicate with your loved ones related to people that are in the group, particularly if you go like I do. I go in a canoe group with a bunch of people, and it's really good to be able to let Grandma know that her grandson is doing fine, so that you come back, you don't suffer the slings and arrows. Okay, next slide. Other possible reasons if you're stuck in a blizzard. And I just was thinking about the fact that back in 1984, I was actually driving in a blizzard that we had. Was one of the most severe ones that we had recently, in which we had 16 people that died. We didn't have any problems then, but for some people even died walking into their house in southern Minnesota. Convenience, to be able to pass information to and from others, to receive information from others. It's alternative to purchasing European cell coverage if you just want to simply send some simple messages back and forth. We talked previously in another meeting about picking up coverage in Europe and other places. This is an alternative to it for some devices, not all the ones we're going to talk about, but some of them can be used outside the United States and can be useful. Okay, so true stories. I don't know if any of you have seen this movie. It was called Six Below. I saw it. It was a true story of a man who almost froze to death after skiing down the wrong side of a mountain. And actually, I think what he did is he might have snowboarded, I think, if I remember correctly. And then he probably would have benefited from a device that would have allowed him to connect to rescue personnel. True story for myself personally. In 2015, I went on a canoe trip to Woodland Caribou Provincial Park with my son and grandson. And just to give perspective for how far away it is, it's over 9 hours drive from my home in Stillwater to where we caught the plane to fly in to the lake that we were on. So when we got to International Falls, we were only halfway. The location where we were is 42 miles from the nearest cell tower, and it was 20 miles to the nearest building. While we were in there, I had adverse reactions to the medication I was prescribed for Lyme that I was diagnosed with just prior to the trip, and probably shouldn't have gone because what it did is made my skin extremely sensitive to the sun. So I was able to use my InReach device, and we'll talk about devices in a minute. It's a satellite messenger, and got a hold of the outfitter, and he was able to get the full plane to come in and pick us up a few days earlier. Okay, true stories. In 2016, I was on a Boundary Waters trip with a friend, and while we were loading packs into my canoe, 2 other canoes approached us coming from the other direction with 4 guys, and they landed at the portage, and 3 of the guys jumped out of the canoe and ran across the portage with their packs, and one guy sat back in the canoe. He says, yeah, I bet you're kind of wondering why I'm just still sitting here. And I said, well, yeah, kind of. He says, well, last night we were in the campsite and we were splitting wood, and I accidentally removed a nice fillet out of my leg and while I was splitting wood. So I said, well, if you like, I can use my InReach device to get you some help right away. But he declined, and then 2 of his friends helped him hobble down the path. But that's a situation that he could have been in really serious trouble if he might have severed a major artery. Okay, personal locator, types of off-grid communication devices. They really fall into 3 kinds of categories. One are personal locator beacons, or PLBs, satellite messengers, and satellite phones. And I'm kind of hedging this a little bit because each of these devices, as time goes on, they give them more and more capability, and the lines between these three categories somewhat blurred. But basically, some of the brands of the PLBs include like the FastFind, the Cerebus, and the ACR. ACR is one I actually used to own and have experience with. Satellite messengers include things like the Spot X satellite messenger. Spot also makes a PLB. And then there's Garmin has a device called the InReach, which I have. And actually, I bought it when it was part of a company called DeLorme, which merged into Garmin. Satellite phones are something also can be used. But we'll talk a little bit about why you may want to avoid those. And they fall into, mainly three different brands: the Iridium, the Inmarsat, and the Globalstar. Here's a little bit of a product comparisons, and this just gets you a general idea. So if you look at things like sat phones, the prices for those range between high 100s to several $1,000s, but I just said for general understanding, their median cost is somewhere around $1,000. The Spot X is about $250. FastFind is $230, Cerebus $500, etc. across the way. You see that basically the main takeaway on this is that satellite phones are roughly double or more of the price of the other devices that I'm talking about. As well, each of these products have subscription fees associated with them. And other than if you have a PLB, a personal locator beacon, which just basically sends an emergency signal, some of those don't have subscriptions. For example, the FastFind is an example of that. But those are basically dumb devices. They basically just send an alert, and they don't do anything else beyond that. Some of these allow you to send texts. The satellite phone also lets you do voice. The number of messages vary by plan, but generally they'll vary by the type of subscription that you have. And a few have extra features such as weather. The InReach in particular has the ability to give you a weather forecast, and I'll show you a little bit more about that later. And some have GPS mapping, which is kind of useful. And other features are described there. Okay, so personal locator beacons. And here I've got a picture of a couple examples. Basically what they do is they send an emergency SOS when you activate it. So you have a dedicated button on the front of the device, and you press that button and it sends SOS. And the SOSs in the U.S. are monitored by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. There's generally speaking no subscription required for just the SOS feature, and that's because the NOAA is a government agency, and they're the ones that are monitoring those distress signals. The emergency PLB SOS response in some foreign countries might work, but it's going to be limited. Some countries actually outlaw PLBs and don't allow them to happen. And some of them have limited monitoring, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But you need to probably contact foreign governments if you plan to use a PLB outside the United States, or at least look it up online to see if you have coverage. Those PLBs, and here's some more pictures of examples of PLBs. They use what's called a Class 2 lithium battery that can transmit an SOS message for up to 24 to 30 hours, and I suspect the 30 hours means that you haven't used the device and the battery's still pretty fresh, because it's got a 5-year life on that battery, and it's not replaceable by the owner. The manufacturer has to replace it. Some of these promise the ability to send an OK type message to a designated person, which I did try to use, and I found it to be not very good. GPS coordinates, in other words, your GPS position often will accompany the SOS message, but typically that works because of how the satellites are able to determine your position. PLBs need to be registered with NOAA Search and Rescue Satellite Aided Tracking Database, which I did do for mine. Satellite messengers send an emergency SOS if you need it. It also has an emergency button on it, just like the PLBs does. But generally, they need to have a subscription, and the plans and fees vary widely. You are able to send non-emergency messages to a designated person, and many will receive also non-emergency messages so that you can work bidirectionally with messages back and forth. One of the things, though, you just notice right away, only one of these has a keyboard that I showed on the screen, and that's generally the case. A lot of these satellite messengers don't have keyboards, so entering text is sometimes kind of a pain in the fingers. Satellite phones use geostationary satellites, and some of them use low Earth satellites in order to communicate, and Iridium and Globalstar, for example, do that. Some of the limitations, they are prone to congestion. Satellites have few voice channels. The amount of talk time is, as I listed here, generally about 3.5 hours with 19 hours. If it's just turned on and you're not talking to anybody, you only have 19 hours of useful battery life. And then satellite positioning is very critical to your voice quality. So if your satellite is in an optimal place for your phone, you're going to have some problems with the quality of the voice conversation that you have. They're expensive. The units typically run between $600 to $3,000. Some of the units do have SOS capability, and your calls per minute are pretty pricey, going from 15 cents to maybe $14 per minute for a call, depending on what you're doing, what user or what your subscription is, and what the provider is. Your airtime subscriptions can be pretty expensive, from $40 up to $200 per month. As well, one of the things I didn't list on the slide here, these devices are considerably larger than the other devices that I've been showing to you. They're more than 2 times as big, and they're quite a bit heavier. Okay, off-grid communications all use satellite network to connect to you. Okay, there's an emergency response center where the messages usually satellite messengers generally contract with a dedicated response network behind the scenes to take your message and go to your local rescue. PLBs use the SARSAT, which is a governmental consortium, in order to get you help if you need it. Typically, satellite phones use a dedicated response networks if they have an SOS function. Designated contacts. All satellite messengers have designated contacts. Somebody sitting at a desk somewhere to take your call if you have an SOS situation. And a few of the PLBs also have a designated contact that will take your emergency if you have one. So how the off-grid communication works, instead of a cell tower, as I mentioned earlier, you do have a device that will talk to a satellite. All the devices send messages to a satellite. So even if you press SOS, that constitutes a message. Some receive the messages back from a satellite. PLBs typically don't, but satellite messengers do. Different devices use different satellite networks, and all networks work fine in the United States, at least for the devices that you can buy in the United States. But global coverage will vary widely, especially in those countries that are not part of COSPAS, and we'll talk about that briefly in a minute. So satellite networks for SOS. So both for a PLB and also satellite messenger. There's a NOAA SARSAT search and rescue satellite aided tracking system, and there's something called the COPAS SARSAT satellite system with a consortium of 45 countries with about 14 satellites. And this COPAS, if you're wondering about it, it's actually from a Russian phrase. It has to do with rescuing people who are lost at sea. Your PLB, if your location, in order to figure out where you are, they use Doppler processing techniques to look at your signal, and from that, and they look at hopefully at least 3 different satellites to determine what your position is, as opposed to a satellite messenger, which it does the work and it figures out what your GPS coordinates are. Your location is estimated by low altitude SARSAT satellite systems. So PLB, your distress message is sent by a device. The message is received by satellite, and then you have an unmanned ground, what they call a LUT, which receives that message from the satellite. That message then is routed to Mission Control Center, which is manned around the block by a government agency. That message then is handed off to a rescue center, rescue coordination center, which is either the Coast Guard or the Air Force, and then they in turn then will call local rescue to come and get you. Unless it's something at sea, then the Coast Guard itself will handle it. Your location is generally included in the stress signal if you're working with a satellite messenger type device. Generally, the PLBs don't do that. Your location is then estimated by your low altitude LeoStar type satellites using Doppler processing techniques. And those actually have done a really good job of rescuing people. You see the lower left-hand corner of the slide here. Between 1982 and 2018, the SARSAT COPAS system has provided assistance for rescuing nearly 49,000 people in 14,531 different search and rescue type events. So even though it's a government agency, they have actually done a good job of helping to get people to safety when they needed it. Satellite messengers are a little bit different in that they allow you to text messages, typically 2-way. Some are 1-way, but most of them are 2-way. And they use a satellite phone network that they buy time on to let you transmit your text across that network. The texts are limited to 116 characters. The quality issues are a little bit less because it's easier to transmit text than it is voice messages. Some of the typical networks that are used are the Radium satellite network. For example, the Garmin products use that. And the Globalstar satellite system, which is the Spot, is the one that uses that. And I'll just say offhand, Garmin and Spot are probably the 2 biggest players in this space, the satellite messengers. GEOS is behind the scenes a private distress signal monitoring response center. So they're involved rather than just relying on the government to field your emergency, because they will take your text. You're actually able to talk back and forth via text with that center to talk about the nature of your emergency is, to say, well, I broke my leg, but I'm really in not much pain, and I can wait, another day before you come pick me up. So you get the conversation going, whereas with a PLB, you basically just send an SOS message, and they really don't know what the nature of your issue is. It's where your SOS messages go to when it's triggered by your satellite messenger, along with the ability that then you can route specific messages to them to talk about the nature of your emergency. They in turn will contact the local search and rescue agencies to actually rescue somebody, And they have worked in almost 200 different countries and territories. That two-way texting between the Geo Center and you is very handy if you really want to get some confidence, because then they come back and they can say, okay, we've talked to the sheriff in your area, and they'll be having somebody over to pick you up in 3 hours. And for peace of mind, it's really nice. Some of the support devices here, the Garmin, InReach, the Marstat satellite phone, Iridium devices, or phones rather, and Spot devices. Satellite messengers typically also have a website behind them, and this is an example over the right-hand side of the slide of something from me on the InReach website. And you can see some of the messages that I had sent and who I've sent them to. And as well, when you look on the site, it actually shows you the location of where those messages were. And it knows that because of the fact that it has your GPS coordinates. And you can see, if you look out there, all of your past messages, and your loved ones or your contacts can see right away, real time, where you're located on a map. It's really pretty handy. If you're also on that website, you can do things like maintain your contacts, you can pay and modify your subscriptions, and you can set options for how your device is going to work with their system. Messaging includes your GPS coordinates. I talked about that a lot, and routing to your GEOS Rescue Coordination Center. The device features include the emergency button and a display screen. And over on the right-hand side, up in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see an example of a Spot messenger. And you can see the display screen it has. And you can see, in this case, they have a keyboard of sorts. The buttons are rather small. One of the things that several of them have is a weather forecast, which I've been using on my device, on my InReach, and I find that very useful. One of the things to be aware of is that trees and hills can affect, just like our slide really earlier on about cell phone towers, trees, hills, cliffs can get in the way of your message. Something to be aware of, and can actually slow down how quickly your message works. However, if you're out in a clear view of the sky, your message can be almost as quick as using an SMS type message to a cell phone. And I've done this. I've done messages where I got turned around with my wife, turn around within less than half a minute on a message. My experiences, I've been an early adopter of this technology. Going back to 2013, I saw a presentation on these devices. And shortly after that, I started getting involved in using them. I used two different messages, the ACR Rescue Link and also the InReach. Rationale for purchasing these devices, first of all, in case of emergency, I want to be able to tell people I've got an issue. And I did see 2 bad injuries when I was in the boundary waters, and also letting our loved ones know that we're okay. Advertised capability to send an I am okay type message is something that Rescue Link, the ACR product, advertised. However, when I tried it, it really wasn't working. You don't really have the ability to send a text per se. You just send a button and it says, I'm okay, because of how you set it up on their website. I used it and I found it to be very unreliable, and the messages were very slow at arriving at a destination, often days later. In fact, some cases after I'd been back home from the trip for a couple of days. I don't know how much I paid for the device originally, but currently they run about $310, and I paid $130 for 3 years of the ability to say I am okay, but it didn't work. Experience with the Rescue Link, I did put a bad review on an REI about it, and I returned the ACR to REI. And then in 2014, I purchased InReach. I used the trade-in of the ACR along with some additional money to buy it. Currently, they run about $400, and it depends on which model you get, how much your cost is actually going to be. I've taken it on 14 different canoe trips, most of the boundary waters, but once to Woodland Caribou, and I showed you that earlier. On the way up to farther northern Ontario, I discovered that my cell phone wasn't working, so I used the inReach to communicate with my family. I hadn't even planned on doing that, but that was a nice feature. In spite of using it quite actively on some trips, lasting as much as 5 days, the battery level has never ran below 40%, so I've always had plenty of battery. Over time, since I've owned it, I've sent 286 messages and received 264 messages and posted 30 times on Facebook. All from this little device that you see on the right-hand side of the screen here, which measures about 5.5 inches tall. The current version of this product is sold as Garmin, and there's actually 5 different versions of the inReach product, just to show you the kind of diversity. And that's true of all these different products. All of them have different versions that you can own. And they run between $350 and $600. The biggest drawback of the device, in my mind, is inputting text, because you have to, go back just quickly to the device. In the center of that device, you see that 4 arrows, one up, one right, one down on the button in the middle. That's what you have to go back and forth until it chooses what the right character is that you want to use to compose your message, and then you hit enter. And so congratulations, you have one character out of a message. So it takes you a little while to compose a message, but when you're in the boundary waters and you're sitting there doing nothing, it's not that hard to do. Annual fee, the right to subscribe per month. Every year you have to pay $25. In addition to that, when you turn it on and actually can send text, then you have to spend $35 to activate that per month. It allows you also to get basic weather, and as well you get unlimited SOS. What I do is I just subscribe for those months that I want to use the device, and any one of your texts, anytime that you have a text message over 160 characters, then you've got 2 text messages, but every message that you do over what your plan is additional 50 cents. One of the things they have is a premium weather forecast, which is $1 a piece. And I'm highly addicted to this. It's invaluable for determining the best day to travel. So if you look in the example, there's 3 screens down below on the right-hand side, lower right, you'll see for today, and it shows you an hour-by-hour forecast, and each one of those will give you even what the wind is going to be, what's going to rain, if it's going to rain, and a percentage possibility of what the rain is going to do. So I found this very useful. So recommendations. If you want off-grid communications, I would say don't buy a satellite phone unless you're really rich. Instead, buy a PLBR messenger. If you're simply looking for something that allows you to send an SOS, get an ACR or a Spot. Those are probably the 2 market leaders in that space. If you want to do satellite messaging, use a Garmin Explorer inReach, or possibly the Spot X, which is a satellite messenger if you want to communicate with others. Where to buy? You can get them at REI, you can buy them at Amazon, and in some cases, many of the cases, you can actually get them direct from the manufacturer. You can, as well as you can rent them. Many of the outfitters have them, and there are some outdoor equipment rentals websites where you can rent things like this. I have no experience with them, but I've noticed that those are available there. One last thing. There's emerging technology. Probably everybody's heard of Elon Musk. He has this effort that he's doing called Starlink. He's using SpaceX satellites to launch satellites into low orbit, which will now let you have internet excuse me, at least their idea is to be able to get it any place in the world. Excuse me. And it promises to give you low cost, high speed global internet. Now it's kind of uncertain at this point. Sorry, how that's going to work and how that's going to be rolled out. Originally, what they were talking about is rolling out this year, perhaps by October, and then globally in 2021. It does use a receiver, which is basically the size of a pizza box. So maybe it's not as easy to use in a wilderness type situation, but it's another alternative. There's also some latency issues because basically you have to send a message over 270 miles up into space and then back again. So it's not going to be like quick turnaround. If you're trying to surf the net, it may not be a right way to go. But this could be a changer to what happens in the space of off-grid communications. It's not rolled out for subscription. It's not generally well known that he's even working on this. They have to date launched about 420 satellites that are about the size of the top of a desk or a table. And they do that in a group. So we'll have a group of satellites. They all shoot off and disperse out of a satellite all at once. And then they have a plan that they're going to disperse something like 12,000 satellites by 2027. So thank you for your participation. Do we have any questions?
I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but
I probably blew everybody's mind here.
Yeah. Thank you very much, though.
You're welcome.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Well, I found it very interesting. One of the things I determined when I was going through this is, first of all, how much I'd remembered about this topic when I started to put the slides together, but more importantly, how much I really didn't understand about the topic until I put the slides together.
No, this is Tom. I think also it points out how fast some of this stuff is changing. Technology and the capabilities of these different devices and phones are only going to continue to evolve very quickly, and more capabilities and faster connections anywhere to anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree, Tom. And if I got out my crystal ball, I would say maybe in 10 years, these devices are going to be eclipsed by something much better and easier to use. And I should add one of the things I was going to mention, but I didn't point out in the presentation. Several of these devices, you're able to get around the text entry thing by pairing it up with a mobile phone. That can make it a little easier to use, but I really don't want to use a mobile phone when I go into a wilderness situation. Even though you can just take a USB cable and pair them up, it's not what I want to do.
Yeah, maybe I'll mention a little bit. Chuck had asked me earlier about the Elon Musk satellites and what I thought of it, and I said, probably the biggest hurdle for general adoption is the latency of the signal having to go up to the satellite and back down there means that you do have delays there because the speed of light is only so fast, and when you're talking people expecting very fast responses, if you have a fiber optics connection today, it would be slower there.
Yeah, you'll be less than satisfied with this.
Yeah. On the other hand, if I came from a small town in Minnesota, if I was out in a farm right now and didn't have a high-speed connection, having a better connection that could essentially pump gigabytes of data would be a welcome addition at this point. So depending on where you're located and what your current services are, some of these new services are going to be very worthwhile.
Yep. Well, one other thing I'll add to if there's any souls still brave enough to be tuned in, if you're interested at some point and want to see it, I can bring in my satellite messaging device and let anybody look at it if they'd like to see it. To a future meeting if we actually ever meet in person again.
Okay, I see.
Or you could hold it up in front of a camera.
Well, I could do that right now if you like.
But we did get some questions. First, Bonnie thanks you for the sharing. New topic for her. It was a new topic for me too. But she's asking, how did Tesla or Elon Musk get the okay to set up those satellite links and the whole satellite network?
It's a great question. And anytime you do a presentation, somebody's going to ask you a question you don't have a clue about. This falls into that category.
If you Google it, I'll suggest people Google it. I believe a year or so ago, there was like a 60 minutes piece on it, and it's quite interesting what they went through and the number of catastrophic failures they've had in launching groups of satellites. Where if you remember last year or two, a couple of Elon Musk's rockets that blew up. A lot of those were these satellites because they're very small devices. And they don't cost that much, so they can put them up into space. Compared to these billion-dollar satellites, they can put a lot more of these up and that. But they're still in the process of putting up more and more of these satellites.
So there it is right there.
Maybe unshare your screen there.
John? Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah, stop sharing, and then your video will come up for everyone.
All right.
Okay, now pop it up.
Is that better?
There you go.
Yeah, and if you Google it, the one source I found most interesting and had the most information about the Elon Musk initiative was a Business Insider article. So I'd look for that.
Yeah, I see.
And Mitch, I'll let you address that, Tom, but the round trip latency, I was going to comment the same thing. It's not so much about the speed that's traveled. I think it's about the communication and maybe having to repeat the signal before it's captured adequately. But maybe, I don't know if Tom had a further comment on that.
Yeah, the issue, and Mitch is correct. Certainly, the speed of light is fairly fast, compared to everything. The trouble is, once you start diving into the intricacies of how the information is passed on the internet, it's put in packets. And these packets, so if you are watching a movie or this presentation or things like that, for Chuck to speak or to show anything on the screen, that's involved with literally thousands and then millions of packets going back and forth between servers and that. And so to transmit, you have literally thousands and millions of these packets. And so for myself to connect to a Chinese server, the best response that I can hope for at all is maybe a 2-second latency. And we see it even today with when we have these chats and meetings. The trouble with speaking, people will speak over each other and things like that because there's latency. My signal is going to a server, and then from the server it's going out to everybody. Well, that latency isn't instantaneous, like I'm sitting right across from Jim and I hear him speak and I stop immediately. No, there's a half a second or a third of a second, and because it's broken up into these packets, and if there's retransmissions, it even slows it down slower. So you have all this overhead going on, which slows everything down there.
Thank you. And Ed Jacobson had shared in a nutshell in the chat that same issue, that it's about the large packets and several packets that need all to be put together, and that's what leads to the total latency.
Right, right. And nothing goes direct. Nothing goes direct from the satellite to my computer. So it has maybe an additional 10 stops of servers in between and stuff like that. So you can look up all the statistics and everything out there, but it's a case of it can only go so fast, and the faster you can make the connections, the better off everybody is. And that's part of the difference. I gave the presentation before on the cellular networks now adopting 5G. Well, 5G is much faster than what 4G is, and part of that reason is the antennas aren't as far away and the wavelengths are shorter, which makes it faster that way. And that, so there's all kinds of things going on to improve everything for everybody.
Okay, well, we're at 12:30. I thank you again, Chuck, for the presentation. If there aren't any other questions, I think we can end our meeting today. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck.
You bet.